In this video, we'll take our existing UI style guide from our e-commerce web design and build an HTML and CSS prototype. In this demo, I'll go through two ways of approaching our layout. I'll use CSS Floats and CSS Grid to lay out some sections of my style guide. You can use either method, it's entirely up to you. You can also read through the provided notes for alternative ways for approaching either technique. Building a coded prototype is a great way to present your client or developer with an interactive visual style guide. This not only allows them to interact with elements such as buttons, icons, and navigation menus, but it allows them to get a sense of how the rules of your design would be applied for various screen dimensions and resolutions. It's always a good idea to sketch out your layout ideas before coding your prototype. This will give you a sense of how to structure your HTML and plan your CSS for each element. I'm using these sketch sheets that are available for download on my website. Click on the link in the description if you have access to a printer and would like to use these for planning your layout. Before we begin, let's make sure we have our project folder set up for the web and download the template file I've provided to get started. Pause this video and download the template provided in your course files. I've also placed the link to the template files in the description below. I've also created a slide deck with written notes and code snippets that are similar to this demo in our course files, so feel free to read over them or use them as a reference in addition to this video. Once you've downloaded the files, let's extract the web template zip file and open the HTML and CSS file using brackets. You can split your view and preview your HTML page by selecting the lightning bolt icon in the top right corner. Now that our files are ready to go, let's import our Google Fonts, set our container, and start styling our type scale. Let's head over to Google Fonts and grab the fonts we need for our style guide. I used Avenir and ITC Century for my original style guide. However, I'll use alternatives for my web layout since they're not available as web fonts. I'll search and add each font and their weights to my collection and then click on the Import tab. I'll copy the code snippet in between the opening and closing script tags and paste this at the top of my CSS file. For your convenience, copy the font family properties and paste them in your CSS file as well. You can comment them out by highlighting them and holding the Command or Control and / key on your keyboard. Next, let's set our HTML root font size in our CSS. This will set our base root, which we set in our type scale. If you've kept your base at 16 pixels, then there's no need to adjust this. However, if your base is 18 pixels, we can change this now. Remember to convert your units from pixels to percentages, or you can use ems. To convert pixels to ems, divide your pixel value by 16, which is the base unit for your HTML browser. So for example, 18 divided by 16 is 1.125 ems. Then to convert your m to a percentage, multiply your m by 100. This will give me 112.5%. I can now set my HTML font size to 112.5% if this is what I'd like to change my base root to. Next, we can set our body tag styles. I like to include styles that will be consistent throughout my viewport. For instance, I'll apply my main font family and text color at the bare minimum. Next, let's set up our container in our HTML and set some width and positioning properties in our CSS. For my layout, I'd like to treat each section of my style guide with a different background color that spans the full width of my screen, no matter what the width. So I'll make my HTML container have a width of 100%. In my HTML, I'll create a div class called container. Then I'll go over to my CSS file and declare my container class and add a property for the width and give it a value of 100%. Now that we have our Google Fonts imported and we have our container set up, let's take some time to bring our type rules and style them according to our scale. We'll start with our H1 and work our way down to our H6 styles. If the majority of your headings share similar property values, group them together by including each heading on the same line and adding a comma in between them. Then add the common values to the group. For my style guide, most of my headings use Nonito sans. So I'll give them all the same value and then override any others with a different font family when I need to. Remember to include a browser-safe fallback and a generic fallback for support. Use ems or percentages for your font sizes for accessibility and add things like color, line height, margin spacing, or text indents where applicable. If you have titles, subheadings, or any other decorative styles that fall outside of the heading scale, go ahead and add those as well. You can include anchor links and paragraph styles as well. Next up, we'll set up our header, logo, and navigation structure for our style guide. We'll be using the logo image file we use for our XD style guide and mockup in this section. So make a copy of it and save it to your web project folder's image folder. The first section we'll create is our header. Again, since I'd like to have the color of my section span the entire width of my browser, I'll actually create a 100% width wrapper around each of my sections. This wrapper will only contain my background color and possibly a height property. Then I'll place a section inside of each wrapper and give it a max width and center it on my page using margin 0 auto. In this example, I'll also make my header fixed so that when a user scrolls down the page to view my style guide, the navigation and logo inside of my header will always be visible. To do this, you'll notice that I will add a Z index to my header. Think of the Z index as positioning sections on layers. By default, all sections are on an even layer. I've given my header a value of 3 so that it appears above all other sections. In this demo, I'll be using my H1 to define my logo and also add an anchor tag to the logo. This way, when a user clicks on the logo, it will take them to the home page and make the page scroll to the first section on the page, which is my header. To do this, I've placed an anchor tag around my logo div ID and added a section link to it. I've also placed a span tag inside of my H1 tag. This is because I want to send the text off the viewport in order to only see my logo image, but still allow screen readers to read my H1 text for accessibility. Once I'm done structuring my header and logo, I'll begin to style them within my CSS. You can adjust the width and height of your logo depending on its size. Take a look at my code on screen and/or in the code notes provided. Finally, let's add the navigation to our header. I'll include a simple horizontal navigation menu. I'll start with setting up my nav menu inside my HTML. Then I'll place my nav links inside of list items, which will be defined as an unordered list. Since we're using a smooth scroll effect for our navigation, I'll add the section IDs within my list item anchor tags. To do this, add a # before each of the section ID names. Once our HTML is structured, let's go over to our CSS and style the navigation, list items, and anchor text inside of the list. I've defined the width of my navigation and used nested properties to style my list items and anchor tags. You can go ahead and change your colors, fonts, and spacing to match your own style guide. You can also include styles for your navigation link hover states. So far we've completed our header, logo, and navigation menu. Now we'll get into the main sections of our style guide prototype. The first section we'll create is our introduction section. In this section, we'll add a subtle CSS animation to bring in our text and give the viewer an overview of what to expect within our style guide. I'll be using Animista to grab a quick snippet of code that will animate my text on page load, and I'll also use Font Awesome to bring in some icons for my style guide. I've placed the link to Animista and Font Awesome in the description. First, I'll go to my HTML document and create a full width wrapper to contain my introduction section and place my main section inside like we did with our header. Let's make a div ID called Hero Wrapper and then place a section ID inside called Hero. Remember, our section IDs should be identical to our navigation IDs in our anchor tags. Inside of the Hero section, I've added an H1 tag and placed my title inside. If you'd like to force a line break or decorate a word or words separately from your H1 style, wrap them with a span tag like I did. You can then target the span tag within your H1 to give it alternative values. I'll also search for a chevron icon from Font Awesome and copy and paste the class into my HTML file. Our template is already set up with Font Awesome, so all we need to do is bring over the icon's class ID and it should display when we preview our page. Once I'm done, I'll head over to my CSS file and style my hero wrapper, hero, hero h1, paragraph text, and icon inside of the section. Now we'll add a simple animation using Animista. Let's go over to animista.net, search for a simple text animation, and copy the code for our HTML and CSS. I'll use the class name for my animation and add it to my hero section. Let's save our file and then preview our page. Our animation should load once we refresh the page. To see it again, hold Command or Control R on your keyboard to refresh your browser. So as our style guide comes together, we'll now continue adding each section as we go using the wrapper technique we've been applying for our previous sections. I'll be staggering background colors as I go, so for my next section, I'll make the background white and then make the background a light gray. I'll then keep alternating until I've completed all my sections. Our first style guide section will be our grid. We can replicate the order of our static style guide to make things easier. In this demo, I'll use CSS Grid for this section. If you'd like to see how we can get the same result using floats, look through the slide deck and notes in our course files. So in this example, I'll show a series of grid layouts. I'll have 12 independent elements that I'll need to display to show how my grid will be used to lay out objects and text on my page. Seeing that CSS Grid counts where an object begins and ends, we'll need to set up a grid of 13 lines if I have 12 objects. This means we can tell the grid to start an object on the first line of the grid column and end on the 13th line in order for it to take up the full width of the grid container. If we want to display two objects that take up half the width of the grid container, we can start one object on the first line and then end on the 7th line, and then begin the other on the 7th line and end on the 13th line. This will result in having two objects side by side at 50% of the container's width. So let's begin setting up our grid wrapper and grid section in our HTML file. I'll add my h2 tag first and give it a heading of the grid. Then I'll create a div class called grid container, which will be displayed as grid in my CSS. Inside of the grid, I'll include 12 div classes and name them each item 1 through item 12. My first item will be the full width grid, 1/1. My second and third items will be used to display a half grid. Then my fourth, fifth, and sixth items will be a 1/3 grid. And then items 7 through 10 will represent my 1/4 grid. And just for fun, I'll mix a 3/4 and 1/4 grid using item 11 and item 12. Once that's all set up, I'll save my HTML and move over to my CSS. Now I'll style my grid class container. So I'll display this as grid. I'll set my grid template columns to auto, then add the gutter space of my grid column by adding a grid gap property. I'll also align my text to the center of each grid. And now I'll add some padding, background color, and margin spacing to the div items inside of my grid container. Lastly, I'll position each column along my grid using grid column start and grid column end for each item class. Now we can preview and save our document. So now we're at the midway point of our style guide. We'll now display our color palette using CSS Grid. My style guide has 4 colors, so I'll create a grid using 5 grid lines. As we did above, create a wrapper div for your color section and then place your color section ID inside of it. I'll add my h2 and give it a heading of the colors. Next, I'll add a color container class, which will be displayed as grid in my CSS. And now I'll set up the markup for my color tiles. So I want to display 2 color tiles side by side and then label each color tile with its hex code underneath. To do this, I'll create a div class called color tile and then give an ID of the color I intend on filling it with. Before I close the div class, I'll add another div class called hex and place the hex code in between the brackets. Then I'll close the color tile div class. So now I'll have the color display above the label. I'll continue to create a div class for the remaining colors in my style guide. To make things easier, I can copy my existing grid container CSS and reuse some of the styles. I'll rename it color container. Next, I'll style my hex class and each color tile ID. For each color tile ID, we'll apply the grid column start and end. In my case, I'll start the first color on column 1 and end on column 3. Then begin the second color on column 3 and end on column 5. If I want the third color to start under the first color, I'll start on the first column again and end on the third, and repeat for the fourth color ID. So now let's save our file and preview it. What I'd like you to do now is go through the notes I've provided and experiment with your own style guide. Include your own icons from Font Awesome, explore different animations, and feel free to play around with using CSS Grid. Moving forward, I want you to go ahead and add a section for our type scale and conclude with your buttons, links, icons, and product cards. I hope this demo got you off to a good start with coding your style guide prototype. Feel free to leave comments and questions below and like this video if you found it helpful. As usual, share it with others who might find it useful, and I'll see you all in the next one.